Hi everyone and welcome to the Faking It podcast. I'm here with Serena, a friend of mine who also is the head of the Stanford SAED. What does it stand for?
Students Against Eating Disorders.
Students Against Eating Disorders. Yes. We're anti-eating disorders in this group, which is super awesome. I met you because I actually joined the group and it was just so helpful for me last year, just having that as a resource. So thank you, first off, for creating that program for students to be a part of, that it still exists right now. Do you want to just introduce yourself to my Faking It fam and tell them a little bit about who you are?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. This is an honor. My name is Serena. I am a senior at Stanford studying political science, psychology, and human rights. I'm from the Bay Area originally, and I started SAED with a couple friends, we restarted a club that had previously existed in order to provide a forum for people to engage in discussions about body image, about relationships with food and mental health. Mm-hmm. And it's become an organization dedicated to promoting healthy body image, healthy relationships with food and ourselves. Mm-hmm. So it's been a really rewarding experience. And we host a support group every week, which has been really amazing.
It's pretty crazy that you restarted this program because, as we both know, a lot of students at Stanford have eating disorders or disordered eating. And so to me, it's really astounding that it didn't always exist. And that even the community that we have that you created is so small. You know?
Right.
Do you want to talk about a little bit about your journey with disordered eating disorders, and then we can talk about it in the context of college campuses?
Yeah, for sure. So I was probably around 11 or 12 when I first started struggling with disordered eating. Mm-hmm. It turned into a full-blown eating disorder by middle school. And a lot of people around me were kind of basking or glamorizing this kind of culture of disordered eating. You know, it was considered cool or hipster to not eat very much or to cut your food up into small pieces. And that was kind of a big part of my middle school life.
Amongst men and girls and boys?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Among both, but I'd say especially among young girls. Okay. Especially because we were on all these websites like Pro Anna, TikTok, and I guess TikTok didn't exist then, but forums like Tumblr, which kind of talked about tips for how to have an eating disorder. And it was very, very harmful at that age.
So you were looking at these resources, these blog forums with your friends together?
Yes.
And then with the hopes of developing an eating disorder, or just because you guys wanted to lose some weight and this seemed like a fast route, or?
Yeah, it was initially, it started with just let's lose some weight, or or kind of when I was already in the eating disorder, I was how do I maintain this for years? And
I'm sorry, I inappropriately laugh sometimes.
No, you're so good. It's so true. It honestly is funny, but basically, my friends were kind of let's check this out online. Someone sent it to me, and eventually it just became a part of our identities almost. Yeah. And it became really harmful because I already had developed an eating disorder before. I'd even seen these forums, but they perpetuated it and encouraged it. They're this is how you escape your doctors from finding out, or this is how you keep staying in that eating disorder.
Yeah, that's so crazy. It's funny. Well, it's not funny, but it happens to be that I also went to these websites when I was 17 because I wanted to develop an eating disorder. That's what I told myself. I want to lose weight. The fast way to do that is to develop an eating disorder. I'm going to go to find these, I've heard about these websites on a TV show or something, and I was able to find them. Yeah. And even us having this discussion right now is us technically telling people that this exists. What are your thoughts on just how the media plays a role in all of this? Just pause in your story, or I don't know.
Yeah. Generally. Yeah. I think the media has a really important role to play. There's a lot of content out there that in some ways fetishizes or glamorizes disordered eating or eating disorders. I think it's hard because I want to caution parents and people who are young themselves from going on these forums. And at the same time, I don't want to give weight to them or kind of spotlight them. So it's a little bit of a tricky situation, definitely. But I think the media plays a really important role in kind of portraying disordered eating and eating disorders and showing people this is what it looks like to spread awareness on one hand, but on the other hand, for people who actually have eating disorders or who are prone to developing them, seeing any sort of depictions of them can be triggering, can be reinforcing, etc. So it's a really hard thing to handle.
Totally. I saw To the Bone. I think that was a Netflix. Have you seen it as well?
Yes.
Yeah. I should not have watched it. I watched it when I was in my eating disorder, and it was literally giving me ideas on how to vomit, and it was oh, you can do that. That's smart. And I was literally learning from it. But the thing is, the way I look at it is that this media is going to be out there. Either it's on Netflix and it's like super accessible, or it's on these weird blog websites like that you find, it's going to be there. And so I think like the best thing to do is just create as much content that's trying to help people with eating disorders too, using the media for good, because I think that there's no way to really prevent the bad media that is going to be out there, that's going to be put out.
Really well said. I completely agree. Yeah. It's hard to block, though just more forums will come up.
Right, exactly.
It's hard to regulate. So the best thing we can do is just create kind of counterculture, people trying to encourage healthy relationships.
Totally. So continuing your story, you developed an eating disorder. Friends around you did that too. When was it like a thing where you're like, okay, I have this, I want to get better maybe? Or when did you hit that point?
So in high school, I struggled pretty much all throughout high school. When I was a junior, I actually wrote an essay in my English class talking about how I felt like I was constantly running on a treadmill, and it was kind of like a metaphor for me, like being constantly on this like path that I could not escape, where it was like constant thoughts about cyclical thoughts about food, about exercise, about body image. And my teacher found it very concerning and called my mom. And that was when my recovery started. It was kind of forced recovery. So I ended up going to UCSF, and they have a great program there. I did family-based treatment, which I would go in with my parents every week, and I would have doctor's appointments, checkups, psychiatry, psychology.
Wow.
And so that I was very fortunate to get access to resources. But I did that until I went to college, basically. And then in college, I took a break from like eating disorder resources, but eventually needed some more support. So had some help again.
Yeah. And before we get into like why college was probably a triggering place, which we'll get into, do you want to explain, because not everybody listening to this has had an eating disorder. Right. What is it like to have an eating disorder? Like, why does it suck? Obviously it's not healthy, but what else? Because I mean, like, I think we should both share just the struggles and the weight that you carry while having an eating disorder.
Yeah, it's horrible. I honestly have a host of related mental illnesses, but if I had to pick my least favorite one, it would be the eating disorder, because not to compare, of course, but it's so tough. Like you kind of wake up and the first thought is like, how can I, influence my shape and weight? How can I lose weight? And then throughout the day, it's like constantly thinking about food, even when you're eating, when you haven't eaten, when you're anticipating eating, counting. I basically can know the calories of every single food that ever existed because of it, which makes me really upset because now I can't unlearn those things. And it's just kind of not appreciating people for who they are, but instead comparing yourself to them. There's just a lot of horrible things that really don't align with my values, which make me really, really sad that I had dealt with this for so long, and happy that I'm now on the other side. But in general, I would say it affects everything. It affects your cognitions. It affects your daily life. It affects your personality. I became isolated from my friends. I didn't talk to anyone. Yeah. And that was kind of my big focus.
What about social outings? Did it affect that at all for you?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I would avoid social places where I knew there was food.
Right.
Or I would just kind of hide in the back the whole time, making sure I wasn't touching anything. And it made me ashamed of what I look like. And so I wouldn't want to go out in public. And so it really kind of took a toll on my friendships and my family relationships too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think people underestimate the weight of eating disorders, and they think, okay, you struggle with food. I struggle with food too, but really it's about so much more than that. I mean, for me, I remember literally feeling like my brain is working faster once I was really recovering from my eating disorder. I remember feeling the cognition just amping up in my brain and acknowledging that, oh, I didn't realize that my brain wasn't working then. I didn't realize that I was legitimately slowed down from having this eating disorder. Because when you're in it, you don't realize how much better you could feel and be when you're not in it. I think that was one of the biggest things for me too, is just realizing that, I actually am more energetic. I have more energy to just jump, you just feel weak all the time when you're in an eating disorder. And it's crazy how much that affects you. My sister, after I started getting better, she thought I was on coke. I'm not even joking. She genuinely did not believe me because I went away for 3 months and I came back and it was I really healed a lot during that time. And she's like, Miriam, I want to talk to you. If you're doing drugs, you can tell me. Wow. I'm not joking. That's insane. It was crazy. And she literally thought it was coke because I was just so much more alive. And it's just crazy how much that your personality is just sucked out of you. You become more of a zombie, and the more I thought about it, the more angry I got, because this also ties into what the patriarchy and misogyny wants, is women to just be there, be skinny, be demure, you know, not have something to say. And when you're constantly thinking about food, you're not thinking about how to make the world a better place. You're not thinking about like, what do you want in this world? Rather, you're thinking about what do other people think of me, you know? And so like, these are also, there's just so many layers as to like what this eating disorder does to people.
Absolutely. That's really well said. And you're so right to point to the physical effects, which I didn't even get into, which is like, it really changes like the way that you are able to move through the world, and it influences everything. And so the zombie analogy is like perfect. It's like you don't feel like yourself.
Yeah.
It definitely is like night and day.
Yeah, it's crazy. All right, so college. Let's talk about college. This is definitely a place, like I'm looking at some data. Apparently, most people develop their eating disorders between like 18 and 19 years old, which is around the time when they come to college. Right. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experience, and then generally, if you have any knowledge to share?
Sure. So when I actually came to college, I actually had a really positive experience at first because I was in an environment where I was just learning so many things and feeling so like my cup was filled every day. But I started to see all the triggers kind of unfold towards like my sophomore year, living in environments where a lot of other people are struggling. But there's so many things in college that influence and promote kind of disordered eating and eating disorders. To name a few, like first, you're in a new environment where you have so much independence. So it's very easy to kind of like fly under the radar and not eat as much, restrict your intake, engage in behaviors, whether that's bulimia, binge eating disorder, anorexia, or any other form of eating disorders. The second thing would be that a lot of people around you are struggling too. So it's easy to kind of compare yourself to kind of get, eating disorders are very competitive. So it like gets into this kind of stage where you're like, oh, if she's not eating or he's not eating, I can not eat. Or if this person's like, you know, using laxatives or going to the bathroom all the time, I can do that too. So there's that piece as well. And then clinicians have also said that like the pandemic has really exacerbated things for sure. I know like a lot of people who struggled during the pandemic due to isolation, due to social media pressures and kind of living our lives online. But college in general, I think, those are the main things. Like having, you know, going to dining halls and having so many options can be really overwhelming for a lot of people. Living in an unstructured environment for the first time, not having like 3 meals a day. Like in high school, we have like lunchtime. In college, it's kind of like you have to build your own lunchtime.
Totally.
So there's a lot of factors.
Yeah. And I think what's like really unfortunate is that I didn't know that this was like going to be hard until after the fact, and I learned more about it. But I think there's so many girls already or people coming into college struggling with like some sort of disordered eating and just not being aware that this is going to be a problem for them now. Like not being aware that they have to figure out their own eating schedules, how to manage the dining halls, all of that. They don't know that this is going to be hard. And then they kind of get just like hit in the face with it all, which I think that's what kind of happened to me like freshman year. I remember coming to Stanford and being like, okay, like there's just ice cream 24/7. Like this is hard for me to have that access, you know, and I would binge like all the time because of it. And so what advice, like what can people do? I don't know. Is there any like advice that you can give to people on how to, maybe somebody listening that's like going into college or has a kid that's coming into college, on like what they can do about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I actually just gave a presentation with one of my co-leads, to a bunch of peer supporters who are basically students who are trained in providing health advice to other students. And the advice we gave them at the end of the presentation was like, this is how you can maintain your stability and health during college. Is like, one thing is to like really plan ahead. So think about what your triggers are going to be, or what's going to be hard for you, and kind of make sure you have a schedule where you can fit in meals is like really important, and having that structure sometimes. And then just leaning on your support system. So like having people you can talk to, people who check in with you about food, even if it's not something that you're like super struggling with in high school, like it might be something that like is unlocked in college. So I would say that as well.
Yeah, totally. Just being aware that this could happen. The freshman 15, like that's a stereotype, you know, and people actually do gain weight because of all the new circumstances. And that's also a time when people develop eating disorders, trying to lose that extra weight that they gained. So what can you explain the difference between eating disorders and disordered eating? Because I think a lot of people get more scared by the term eating disorder, like saying they have one, and saying that they have disordered eating maybe isn't as scary. But what is the difference? Is there a difference?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So I would say that eating disorders are clinically diagnosable, and disordered eating is kind of a symptom of eating disorders that a lot of people struggle with. So I think a recent survey found that like up to 60% of girls in college have some form of disordered eating.
That's crazy.
And that numbers are high for men as well. That could mean like, you know, engaging in restriction, engaging in like binging at a time, or engaging in disordered exercise. So like maybe you go to the gym 3 times a day, something like that. So disordered eating can be any patterns that are like, if you're counting all the calories, if you're, engaging in forms of behaviors that may not amount to rise to the level of an eating disorder. So it could be like, just really tracking your nutrients or, cutting out entire food groups. Those are all forms of disordered eating. Eating disorders are basically when you have all those behaviors and it rises to the level where it's really impacting your ability to do other things.
Got it.
It's really impacting your cognitions. It's impacting you have preoccupations. You can't think about anything else. And it becomes so kind of cumbersome in your life that it becomes what's a clinically diagnosed disorder.
Right. Totally. And I think also another thing is like eating disorders tend to not always be diagnosed. People don't always,
Absolutely.
For me, I technically was never diagnosed with an eating disorder, but I had an eating disorder,
sure. Yeah.
I went through all of it, and so I think that people also don't want to self-diagnose themselves because it feels weird to do that. But I would encourage people to honestly do that, self-diagnose, so you can then get the help, even if you're not technically going to like an eating disorder clinic or, technically getting that like exam done to see, does this qualify as an eating disorder? Also, another thing to note too is that it was only 10 years ago in 2013 when binge eating disorder became a legitimate eating disorder.
Right.
Which is kind of like absurd,
So crazy.
Yeah. So if let's say you were binging in 2012, they wouldn't call that an eating disorder.
No.
And so I don't think that qualifying in this like bucket really means much. It's really, you can qualify for any of these things and then try to get help for that. And so my next question would be, if you have a friend who has an eating disorder or is struggling, what are some ways that you can support them?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. Well, first of all, you're so spot on. Like diagnoses mean nothing, especially because more like Black, Indigenous, and people of color don't receive diagnoses or don't get help. A ton of people who are low income don't get help. So many people from marginalized backgrounds are still struggling to receive the help that they need, or it's underdiagnosed in a lot of communities of color and a lot of different cultural communities. So I would definitely say that's definitely true. And so if I had a friend who was struggling, who maybe came from one of these backgrounds or even did not, I would try to support them as much as I can. The first thing I would do was kind of assess a little bit of like, what exactly is the struggle they're facing, and maybe there's an underlying root to it. I would encourage them to reach out for professional support if they're able to access that resource. So like therapy and psychiatry are great, but they're not accessible to everyone, to be honest.
Yeah.
So if you can't, see a therapist or see a doctor, just doing regular checkups on your health is super, super important still. If you're a college student, going to your college health center can help, and just like letting them know what's going on. And then dietitians are also a really important piece of this. They can help people through eating disorders. And if none of those options are available, then looking for peer support can be great. Right. So like we run a peer support group at Stanford, but there's also similar things at many other schools. Or just like there's lots of programs, like there's the organization Project Heal that raises money for access to treatment. And also has like a mentorship program. And then there's like so many other great nonprofits that are working in this space to increase access to care for people. So checking out those would be great.
That's awesome. Yeah. And some points I'd add on to that too is if you have had an eating disorder or have struggled, then you're definitely in a good position to support a friend in the sense that you can say, oh, I've been there. I know what that's like, and that personal story and that personal like empathy and compassion that you can have, I think really carries a long way. I know for me, that's really how I've been able to get through to some of my friends is because I'd say to them, like, you need to see a therapist. I'd be like, can I be blunt with you? I've literally done this before and they'd be like, okay. And I'd be like, I know you have an eating disorder.
Wow.
I've done that multiple times to tons of my friends and they'd be like, oh yeah, like I do. And I'd be like, I've had one too. I'm still recovering from mine. And I would just be as vulnerable and like make it normal to have an eating disorder. Like, oh, it happens to so many people. This is so normal. And be like, do you see a therapist? No, I don't. Why not? And just like kind of giving like, well, at least my method is just giving someone like a tough love and being like, you should see a therapist. And these are the reasons why. And when they say it never worked for me, say, well, I hate to break it to you. I'm a super independent person. And yet this is something that I needed help with. And I hated admitting that to myself. And especially at least Stanford students hate to admit that they need help with anything.
Exactly.
And so but I think just like that tough love. And if you don't know, if you never had an eating disorder or anything like that, you can use me as an example or Serena as an example of people that like are just have had one and like it's okay to need help no matter what. So yeah, I think just like sharing some sort of personal story or somebody else's story is also a great way to talk to people and say like that you're not alone. And speaking about that, I think that feeling alone is a big part of this like the disordered eating too. You want to just talk about the culture of eating disorders. Like the way I think about it is something that is just so silent. We don't talk about it at all. You know, even for me, out of all of the things I talk about publicly, this was the last thing that I decided to bring up. Really. Wow. And the reason was because I was embarrassed. I was genuinely embarrassed to like tell the world that this is something I struggled with. I thought that it made me a weak person for a long time. It took me a really long time to own this part of my identity and be like, no, this is a part of what makes me me. And I want to talk about that, you know?
Yeah.
And so yeah, what are your thoughts on like the silence of eating disorders in our society?
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I actually did a research paper and a study on eating disorders during the pandemic, and I titled it Silent Sufferers, like Eating Disorders a Year into the Pandemic. And what I found from that was that so many people are struggling alone because there's so much stigma around it, just like you said. And it's really, really difficult to get people to talk about it because they feel like it's some sort of personal failing. But I'm here to say, like, it is definitely not. It happened. There's first of all, there's a genetic and biological component. There's also an environmental component. And in the culture and society we live in today, it's so easy to, you know, develop some of these issues because we're being reinforced these messages that say, oh, your body should look like this. We see on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube and etc. all these images of people who we're supposed to look like.
Right.
We see in society that the people who we're supposed to look up to often have eating disorders themselves.
Yeah.
So it becomes so hard to struggle, and a lot of people do it alone. And what I would say is that you really don't need to struggle alone. Like, if you open up to your friends, chances are they'll have struggled with it too. Even if it's not a full-blown eating disorder for them, they might have experience. They can give you some tips.
Right.
And there's so many people out there who want to help you and who are doing great things. Like, there are a lot of influencers who are doing really cool things to kind of portray what it's like to eat a healthy meal, to what it's like to love your body and embrace it. Right. And even if you're not there yet, you can kind of watch these people and as aspirations and kind of see like, this is what I need to work towards. And maybe body positivity isn't necessarily the realm you need to go into, but if you can find a body acceptance, I think that's what's most important. And if you can find some healing in your relationship with food through either peer support, through looking online and looking at resources that are available, looking at those nonprofits I mentioned, looking up to people like you, I think it'd be really helpful for a lot of people. So just know that you don't have to do it in silence.
Totally. Yeah, I love that. I think that like opening up about it, being loud, one does not mean that you're weak or,
Definitely not.
like bad in any way. It's okay. There's no shame there. There shouldn't be. And the more that we talk about it, the less shame that other people will feel to talk about it too. And the more it is so normal. You know, if you look at the data, majority of people have disordered eating. That makes it normal, quote unquote. You know, there isn't anything technically wrong with having that. And that's why it's so important. And the way, another thing too, like you mentioned in terms of body positivity, it's really like a twofold problem. One is trying to heal your relationship with food. And two, it's trying to heal your relationship with bodies. And that's really where the root of this issue is. I know for me, when I was going through recovery, I had an eating disorder nutritionist, an eating disorder therapist, and a body positivity therapist, where I would work on healing my relationship with just liking bodies. And one fun fact, something that's really helped me actually like my body more, is trying to change my framing of attractiveness. Because I think we've been fed that an attractive body is a very skinny body. An attractive male body is a very built body. That's what we've been taught, you know, tall, skinny, boobs, butt, whatever it is in your head of like the hottest person. That's kind of where that's what we compare ourselves to, what we think is attractive, right? And so if you try redefining what attractiveness is to you, instead of a person that you think is super hot, changing that definition to super skinny, to maybe like having some curves, you know, or super like thick, beautiful, lush lips, to maybe having like thin lips, and maybe that's fine. Maybe that's still hot, you know? And so like that was something that really helped me. And then actually like not letting that stop me from talking to people. And once I actually started being attractive to people who had all these different body sizes, I realized, and especially as like a bisexual person, there's like one instance I remember where I hooked up with this girl who was like of a bigger body size, and I was legitimately turned on. I was like, this person's super hot. And after that experience, I was like, oh, I'm attracted to this person and she's a bigger body size. And that means other people can be attracted to me in my body size as it is right now. And that was huge. It was like a huge revelation, you know, which is pretty crazy. Like that's where it really stems from a lot of the times.
That is so well said. And I would also say that like our conceptions of body image and what looks good are like very rooted in racism, capitalism, and so many other isms like sexism, patriarchy.
Yeah.
Like, you know, when people realized like hundreds of years ago that, you know, that people used to think that people in bigger bodies were wealthier and, you know, better. And that changed when people realized that like people of color also had, you know, bigger bodies, and they kind of changed the norm to fit kind of their racial perception of the racialized hierarchy. And there's so many like different issues intertwined with this, but I would say that so many people are struggling today because people hundreds of years ago decided that they wanted to create and commodify bodies and kind of create this environment where girls would constantly be told, and boys, that they're not good enough, that they're not pretty enough, that they're not skinny enough, so that they could sell products and so that they could kind of cement these forms of racism and sexism deeply ingrained in our society.
What are some methods for you that help you like love your body or bodies, other people's bodies too?
I would say I practice affirmations.
Okay.
I work on that with my therapist.
Cool.
So I used to have a sign on my bathroom mirror that said like, you know, 3 things that I liked about myself, even though it was really hard for me at the time to think of any. Like I said, I was like loyal and empathetic, and one day I'm going to help others who have eating disorders, like see, you know, that they can have another side of, that they can come to the other side.
Which you're doing very well.
Thank you so much. And so like, that's one thing I do. And then I also have just remembered sometimes that I need to interrupt body comparison and body checking. So if I'm comparing myself to someone else, instead of thinking like, oh, like I'm looking at their body and what was it smaller than mine? Is it bigger than mine? Just thinking about something I appreciate about them, so that I'm appreciating their wholeness as a person rather than just a single trait.
Totally. Like sometimes for me, what I have to do is just not look at my stomach. Like if ever I feel like I'm like getting into this mindset of like not feeling good about my body, I literally just don't look at my stomach in the mirror. Like I just refuse to do it. And it surprisingly helps, you know? And because it is, our body is a whole, and it's like sometimes we just get hyper focused on the belly button and how much like fat is around it. Like, is it super flat or is it not today, you know? And like, it's just as we get hyper fixed, and it's just better to look at ourselves as a whole or not look at ourselves at all, and just like not just put emphasis on that. And one more thing too about just liking all sorts of bodies. I feel like something in our society right now is, you know, if somebody's like, if your friend's dating somebody, you're like, oh, send me a pic, like, let me see what they look like, you know? And I think another element too is that we get attracted to people of all body sizes, but then we're ashamed or embarrassed if we like somebody that is of a bigger body size. Like it's not considered normal to do that. What are your thoughts on this? And like, what can we do about it?
Yeah, no, fat phobia is a huge problem. And I think I actually wrote a blog for the organization I talked about, Project Heal, called Why Fatphobia was integral to unlearning fatphobia was integral to my recovery. Oh, and cool. That is kind of what I would draw upon here, which is that for so many people, like fear of being in a bigger body, like you really have to interrogate that and get to the root of that. Like, why are you so afraid of being in a bigger body? It's because society has told us that these are inherently unhealthy, lazy, less valuable. But none of those things are actually true. Like so many studies have demonstrated that like weight is not directly correlated with health, that people in larger bodies have eating disorders too, that people in larger bodies often have better health than people in smaller bodies. Totally. So there's just so many components to this. And if we look at the research, if we look at what doctors are saying, like oftentimes there's so much medical fat phobia too. And fat phobia in our society, deeply ingrained in our culture, that it's hard for us to see that like people in larger bodies are equally as valuable in every single way. Doesn't mean they're unhealthy. Does not mean that they're lazy. There's so many components that go into someone's weight and body composition. And fat phobia is so insidious that internalized fat phobia can also perpetuate external fat phobia and create, you know, when I think about this in my recovery, I'm like, if I'm like telling myself that if I gain weight, I'm uglier, I'm worse, then I'm perpetuating the ideal in society that people in larger bodies are inherently less valuable, which is not something I believe. And I don't think it's something that a lot of people believe. So I think we need to work towards kind of unlearning our own biases and also acknowledging that, you know, there's serious fat phobia in the medical field, and the field of psychology, and the field of pretty much every single field. And if we can kind of take that and try to turn it on its head and say, you know, this is something that is not at all correlated with value, I think that would be a really important thing. And a lot of people in larger bodies are saying we need this message to be sent, and so many people are being silenced right now.
Totally. I think that we all need to kiss a person in a bigger body and post it on social media and just normalize that. Are there any resources that you want to share with people and like how to get better? One book that comes to mind for me is The Beauty Myth by Naomi Wolf. Have you read that?
Yes.
Yeah, I read that during my recovery, and I was like, oh, this is so good. It's very like academic, you know, and it's like a thick read. But if you're into that, if you're into like the academic side of things and you want to know the history, it does that very well. And it kind of explains why beauty is the way it is, which is cool.
Super cool. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's a ton of research that I want to flag, but to narrow it down to a few, I'd say organizationally wise, I'm on the youth board of the Eating Disorders Coalition, which is an organization that does policy advocacy. So if you're interested in the policy side of eating disorders and getting, funding mental health in our schools, et cetera, check out them. Project HEAL provides access to treatment. Also been really inspired by them. So if you're someone who needs treatment, wants to apply for like a grant to get treatment, you can look there. And then there's also just so many incredible people out there doing great work. So I really look up to like Victoria Garrick, who's doing a lot of body neutrality and positivity work. And then in terms of just kind of like books and films and et cetera, I really like the book What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, which has been really cool. It's a book that kind of turns fat phobia on its head and talks about that.
That's awesome.
And there's so many articles and resources. So also, if you're at Stanford, please check out Students Against Eating Disorders. We have a support group. We train dining hall staff, nutritionists, Baden, everyone like that, including RAs, RDs, etc.
Yeah, and one final thing I'll say is unfollow anybody on social media that makes you feel bad about your body.
True.
I do it regularly. I'm like, oh, this person's now triggering for some reason. Like, mute. I just mute whoever.
Exactly.
Mute.
You don't need to unfollow even.
Exactly.
You just mute.
So do that. That helps. And yeah, thanks so much, Serena, for coming on to my podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.